Okay, people. So, welcome everybody.
We're not live stream, we're just being recorded, sorry.
I better not say it.
No, it's important to tell people that
we are being recorded. So, welcome to everybody. We're really, really happy to have Kristóf Szombati here today to launch his book. Now, we've been dying to have him launch the book, and we've been pushing and pushing. Actually, it's out now, but we don't have copies yet, correct?
Yeah, we have something like a word.
Okay, good. So, Kristóf, I first heard about Kristóf when Don Kalb used his work in his lectures that he gave here last year. So we had this premonition of Kristóf, and then he was on a panel at AAA, and he gave a great paper. And then we discovered that he was at Columbia doing a fellowship. So CUNY is happy to adopt him here and bring Kristóf Szombati and do this book launch. So we're very happy to have him here. And he's the Istvan Dík Visiting Professor at Columbia University. And he has a background, both a PhD in politics from CEU, but also he founded or co-founded the Green Party, LNP, I'm not sure, and was an elected member of its steering committee in Hungary. So he's got a lot of political and activist experience. So he completed then he left in 2010 and went to Central European University, where he completed a dissertation which won the Best Dissertation Award in 2016. And this is the book that we're going to be able to read, called The Revolt of the Provinces. So we have two discussants here. Do you want to go first, and then I'll...
Sure.
Okay, I'll just say who the discussants are, since we're a small group. So one of the discussants is here, Professor Andrew Arato, who is also from Hungary, although it doesn't say it anywhere, but this is who he is. And he's the Dorothy Hart Hershen Professor in Political and Social Theory at the New School for Social Research in New York. And he has taught everywhere that you can imagine, especially in Europe, but also in Zimbabwe and also in South Africa. And I'm very happy that he was the Bram Fischer visiting scholar at the School of Law, because Bram Fischer is sort of part of my heritage from South Africa. Wonderful. So I noticed that, and other places they called des Otitudes.
He was a great man.
Yes, he was. Yes. So, and he's published many, many books, but one is The Adventures of Constituent Power, which was published by Cambridge in 2017, and Post-Sovereign Constitution Making, Learning and Legitimacy, 2016. There's also a Festschrift, Critical Theory and Democracy, and other books. I'm not going to read them all. But we're very, very honored to have Professor Andrew Arato here from the New School. And then our other discussion is our own favorite lady, Mary Taylor, who I have tremendous respect for her, for running the Center for Place, Culture and Politics. She's the assistant director. She has a book coming out that she's working on, but Movement of the People, Folk Dance, Populism and Citizenship in Hungary. And she's got a number of publications in Focal, the Journal of Hungarian Studies, Left East, and many other that I'm not going to read out. So we're really very happy to have Mary Taylor here as the other discussant, whose work has also been in Hungary and who actually has a PhD from our department, which is one of the reasons we know she's so wonderful. Okay, so Kristóf.
Can I stay here? And
Yeah, I think so.
Way?
No, it's a small group. You can be wherever.
Fine.
As long as people
do we
can.
need the mic, by the way?
Well, sometimes in a room you can't hear.
Because we're recording, it's
I don't
better,
mind. I can
as
use
well
the
as the
mic.
audience would speak into the mic,
Sure.
so that we can pick it up
And I
on
sometimes need
the
it.
video.
Yeah, and I can't hear sometimes.
So this works. Thanks for coming, first of all. We're going to be talking about my homeland, a really small country, and I just wanted to begin by saying a couple of words about why it's worth studying Hungary. What can we learn from it? And the way I think about it is twofold, basically. When we think about politics and the processes driving politics, the first thing is that Hungary appears to be a country that is an early bird case, that is in advance of others. So certain processes are playing out before they happen in other places, and in a way that appears to be faster. So for instance, we've seen the collapse of left-wing or left liberal hegemony, as I call it in the book, earlier than in other places. So my research, for instance, when I started doing it, one of the things that I very quickly realized was that I was confronting this turning away from the left in rural areas. And that this is something that caught my attention and I wanted to understand. Initially, the project was about anti-Gypsyism. But I began to see links between what I saw as popular racism and emerging and bubbling to the surface, and the way people thought about the left, and became disgruntled with the left and felt abandoned by the left. So that's one of the reasons that I think it's important to study Hungary, to understand why left liberal politics collapses, left liberal hegemony collapses, and why we see the rise of a new brand of right-wing politics. I use the term new right in the book, and some people emphasize the populist aspect of this new right. In the book, I rather emphasize the authoritarian aspect. But it's a new right that also relies on strategies of consent and coercion to build its dominance and to maintain its dominance, as we've seen in the last election. And I think it's worth discussing perhaps what the different mix of consent and coercion, of sweeteners and sticks, carrots and sticks, is in this country, because I think it's different. This type of right differs from what we've seen in this country. For instance, it differs a lot from neoconservative politics. It also differs a lot from the center-right politics that we used to see in Europe. And that is, for instance, is still led or administered by people like Angela Merkel in Germany. Two more friends coming. Thanks for coming. So that's one of the reasons, Hungary being an early bird case, and the other is that Hungary is acting as a blueprint, as a model that the new right everywhere is watching very closely and learning from. One of my students in one of the classes that I'm teaching at Columbia, it's a class on how we study far-right movements through ethnographic methods, and I sent my students out in the field in New York to talk to racist activists, people in the alt-right, alt-light, intellectuals, people who are in Charlottesville, etc. One of my students was at CPAC and is very well embedded with the right flank of the Republican Party. And she's begun to try to map the transnational networks that connect Europe and the US, the right on both continents. And she's telling me that people like Bannon or people close to Bannon travel to Hungary every 2 months to meet with officials from Fidesz to learn about how they build that kind of nationalist politics. So these are two reasons to study my little country, because it has begun to matter in these two ways. And some people would add that it also is beginning to matter because there's an emergent East-West divide or a strengthening East-West divide in the European Union, and Hungary is playing the role of the back pupil, as liberals like to say. I would not lay the stress on that, and my book doesn't deal with that, but I guess we could add that as an extra thought. I thought that I would highlight 3 themes from the book, very briefly, that I think are worth discussing, but I'm not sure if that's the right way to go. Would you like? Yeah?
Of course.
Okay, so as I said, this is a very long project. It started out in 2009 when I was still working with Roma in northeastern Hungary. It took me actually 8 years to finish this PhD, and then I realized that it could actually become a book because it already looked very much like a book. And I think there are 3 themes that are worth thinking of before coming here. That's what I thought that could speak to an American audience. One of them I already mentioned. It's why left liberal politics collapses and why people become fed up with it, and why those alliances between popular constituencies and the left break apart. And my book sketches a complicated argument, which I'm not going to try to reconstruct at this point. It would take too long, but I want to highlight rural areas. Rural areas matter a lot for understanding why these projects collapse. And I think, I don't know if any of you has read Ariel Hochschild's book called Strangers in Our Own Land. So she writes about Louisiana, and the way I think about northeastern Hungary is a mix of the Rust Belt and of places like Louisiana. So there's deindustrialization, which is an analog with the Rust Belt, and that's not what I looked at because I thought we understood that better from other writings and other scholarship. I was looking at what happens to what I call the post-peasantry. And what's important to understand is after 1990, the project of moderate conservatives in Hungary who led the transition in the first 4 years was to break apart the cooperatives and to build this new class of people called the post-peasant, which I call the post-peasantry, and who call themselves peasants often. Gypsies also call them peasants, by the way. And it's this group of people who I came into close contact with and who I had the most conversations with. And the point is that after EU accession, these people began to feel very insecure about their livelihoods, about their control over their localities. They basically felt disempowered. And in the book I describe a lot of, I lay the stress on political economic processes, de-agrarianization, de-peasantization, so the collapse of agriculture, because basically Hungary was flooded with cheap goods. Think of Italian wine. Really, there's very cheap table wine that I could buy in the nearby town, which was near my first field site. And I looked at all the products that one could buy, and there's very little that was from the local area or that was even from the country. So my book stresses a lot that aspect, and I look at domino effect, so a cascading cause and effect of the de-agrarianization and de-peasantization. I don't want to go into it because it's complicated, but what mattered was that there was a collapse of certain relationships, notably between peasant patrons and Roma workers. And I call these relations clientelist or patron-client relationships, and they played a major role in stabilizing the local communities after 1990. And what happened is that these were eroded because agriculture collapsed. And this had cascading effects. I can say more about that, but this is a key driver of disillusionment with the project of regime change that was very much seen as a liberal one. And the other important aspect here is that at the same time that this process of depeasantization was advancing, the liberal state was withdrawing key resources from rural heartlands. So there was a project of emancipating Roma. So you are desegregating schools at the same time as you are withdrawing 13-month salaries, for instance, from the teachers. This creates a lot of tensions. And it creates what I've stressed as perceptions of social breakdown in these communities. So the post-peasantry began to blame both the liberal elites and the Roma for this breakdown of relationships, the breakdown of their communities. And this is what the book sketches in detail. That's one of the themes, and I'll be quicker about the two other ones, I promise. The second theme that the book highlights is the nature of this new right. So what kind of politics is this? And I look at the speeches of Orban and try to understand what new party he sketched or made out of Fidesz, which used to be a liberal conservative party. And I think there's two important things to understand. One is an obsession with order, with recreating order, which I can say more about, but it resonated very much with the populations that I just mentioned, because there was a perception of order breaking down in rural areas. So Orban was obsessed with what kind of politics can recreate order, both in communities and on larger scales of the nation state, for instance. And the other was competitiveness. Hungary had to turn to a loan from the IMF, and remember what happened to Greece. Orban understood very well that in order to recreate and remold society, he needed to be independent of international financial institutions. And that competitiveness in an era, we're right after an economic crisis, is probably the most important for, at least, I'm talking about his worldview, right? But was really dominated, I think, by these two obsessions. And the politics he built on that tried to remedy these two. order and competitiveness. And what I sketch out as a book is a type of what I think now I would call a regime that I would call authoritarian capitalist, that tries to extract the maximum amount of labor from society with a view to mostly buttressing the competitiveness of the Hungarian economy. And the state that Orbán built after 2010 was a state that tried to do that. There were sweeteners for the lower middle class, I described that in the book, but there was a lot of coercion on the bottom of society, the 1 million people who actually decided the elections this year. Or the reason that Fidesz received a 2/3 majority has very much to do with the fact that they managed to get 500,000 new voters, and most of them were very poor, destitute people from the countryside, who basically rely on workfare for their livelihood and vote Fidesz because they think that it's better than the deal that they get now is better than the deal that they got from the socialists. And also because of Orbán's great success in orchestrating a moral panic around immigration. But there's a genuine, what I would call a creation of personalized dependencies that I think is very particular to Eastern Europe that we don't see in the US, for instance. So that's a clear difference, I would say, between the Trumpist project and the project of Orbán. Otherwise, I see some certain similarities in the way that Trump has reconstructed the Republican Party to try to basically cater not only to the classic Republican constituencies, the middle classes, but also to the lower middle class, to workers. I can say more about that, but I think there is economic protectionism and nationalist discourse play a very important role in that, in attracting workers and people who are down and out. And the third thing was why Fidesz won the election, and here I just want to reiterate that I think what we have to understand is that Fidesz is seen as being successful and having a number of political achievements in a large section of Hungarian society, actually in all social classes. Fidesz created 500,000 extra jobs after the crisis. It pushed back multinational companies from key sectors in the economy, which resonated very much with the constituencies that I did research with. In the last 2 years, there was palpable real wage growth. There were, as I said, there were material sweeteners for the middle class, tax cuts, and also for the lower middle, utility price cuts. Personal dependencies, as I said, also matter. People actually feel that Orbán gave them, the public works program, which is meager, but it gives them security. And he built the fence against the migrant threat. And I don't want to go too much into that, but that also played a role in this election very, very clearly. So those are the three themes I thought I would mention. And I don't know what's next, but I guess you're going to comment on this and tell me what I did right or wrong.
No, it's a discussion. It's not what you did right or wrong. Would you like to go in?
Okay,
Yeah, I think you might need to turn that mic on.
Okay. Let's see if we can fit it.
Okay, well, I
Make
met,
sure it's turned
Tap
on.
on the end.
Turn on. I met Kristóf a few weeks ago. We never we had not
Take this one.
known each other from before, and for me it was a special pleasure because the people that I know in Hungary are all kind of my age or relatively close to it, and it's a defeated generation. They did some great things. I don't know, Kristóf might not agree with all of what I'm going to say, but the part of the regime change, the way they have negotiated it, the way they avoided bloodshed at all, the way they showed the road even then to many other countries, which imitated also the Hungarian Round Table and so on. Those are achievements, but they made a lot of mistakes too. And today, I don't think, I just had Bálint Magyar teach a course with me a semester ago. He's brilliant and very intelligent guy, but I think he has absolutely no perspective now where we are going or where Hungary could go. And indeed, I don't think he actually understands how we got to where we got. Christoph is not the most optimistic person either. Hungarians don't generally are not marked by their optimistic spirit. You know, Hungarians, when they go to a bar, especially in the provinces, they're being sad together, Bushulung, Egyet Bushulung. That's, I think, a pretty unique way of entertaining yourself, to be sad together. I'm not saying that you're like that, and I'm not like that. But in any case, just because of the strength of your work and I think the fact that you're so much younger than the people that I know, I detect the possibility of a future, and that makes me happy and excited. You know, things are bad right now, but that cannot be the end. And one of the ways, of course, to have a future, a different future than this particularly unpleasant for me, unpleasant Hungarian president, is to try to understand where Hungary is, how it got there, and what are some options, even in that history which could have been exploited, could have been developed. So I think that's what your book is about. I don't know who said it now. I read it in one of the reviews that perhaps, or maybe one of the blurbs, that perhaps this is the best book so far that actually deals with this current turn to the populist right, or the authoritarian populist right. And I kind of agree with that. I think this is really a very, very excellent book on that subject, even though it deals almost exclusively with one country. Ivan Seleny in Introduction compares to Trump, and I think those comparisons are good. But your book is really on Hungary, and I think that is very much justified. But the book on Hungary is put into a broad theoretical framework. And as soon as you start reading it, especially the introduction, you'll see twice he discusses his relationship to Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. I happen to love Polanyi also, and was very much struck that a book on contemporary Hungary is going to be introduced to a reference to the Great Transformation. What he has in mind, and it's very broadly put, I think it impressed Seleny too that you did that, because he also has a love for Polanyi. What he's trying to say is that the first great globalization wave, which Polanyi described, focusing on issues like the gold standard, the self-regulating market, the commodification of money, labor, and land, were his major concepts. That first globalization came to a crisis, and a counter-movement defeated it. That counter-movement, however, though Polanyi is very cautious in presenting it in political terms, but we know was fascism, state socialism in the Stalinist version, and the beginnings of social democracy, which already had its beginnings in the 1930s, but was developed most after the Second World War. So the counter-movement changed the world, but among the options was the authoritarian one, and perhaps at the time of Polanyi's writing, he might have felt that that is the most powerful counter-movement. And the reason why the counter-movement emerges, irrespective now of its specific political form, is because human beings cannot in the long term accept the destruction of their physical being, which is labor, their natural habitat, which is land, and even the means of economic exchange, which is money, and which is the production capacity itself. The Great Depression, as you know, threatened all these things. First and foremost, originally it was the economic crisis, but people's physical suffering all over the world was great. And this, to accept that without a response, when there are organized sectors of society, is impossible. And so the counter-movement emerged, challenging commodification, challenging the logic of self-regulation in different spheres of life and working out different options to control it. It happens, you know, it would be interesting, not recommending that we do this right now, to study the economic policies of Nazi Germany in the 1930s under Heinrich Schacht, which was kind of proto-Keynesian, interventionist now. I'm not talking about all the horrors which already began in 1934 and afterwards, but the self-regulating market was unacceptable to them, as it was going to be to the Keynesians, the Social Democrats, and many others. What your book implies, without drawing too close a parallel like I just did, is that we're in another period of the double movement. The second globalization has again produced, this is the shift in terms of international economy from the Bretton Woods system, for example, to the Washington Consensus. This is the shift from social Europe to austerity Europe. This is the regime changes all over Central Europe, which adopted a kind of a version of capitalism which we assumed was gone in the 19th century, destruction of welfare systems, rapid privatization of everything, irrespective of really determining whether the thing to be privatized. We talk about the collectives, the Hungarian collectives, which are capable of surviving, which were productive, and they were privatized to several tactics in such a way that Hungarian agriculture, your post-peasants, were deeply hurt. So this too was part of that first movement, and it took, probably we can find the seeds of it, I would say, in Russia sooner, even than Hungary, because the Yeltsin period was a particularly disorganized version of the first movement. But it doesn't matter because in a consistent political sense, it was the Hungarian turn that gave this counter movement its initial form. And our problem is that we see that counter movement so far in its authoritarian form, but we don't quite see what this new social democracy is supposed to be like, that after all was part of the counter movement before, or other options which today should be perhaps mentioned. For example, ecological politics, which is very consistent with Polanyi's theory of the defense of land. We don't see that very much as the counter movement. What we see, and what your book is about, is the authoritarian turn, which is Polanyi-esque in its characteristic. Now, this book is not just an application. To my talk so far seems like an application of Polanyi's work. Your book is not, because already in the introduction you make some methodological criticisms of the Polanyi school. Yes, there's going to be a double movement, but what's going to be, what shape is it going to have? How is it going to work? How is it turned into politics? I think those are the questions you raise. And I think for the first question of what shape it will have and how it's going to be, what will be the human motivations that will put it into motion, you now double as an anthropologist. I think the Polanyi thing shows that you're a social theorist who knows how to do social theory and use it for empirical work. The second step in your argument is that of the anthropologist or the ethnographer, because the two big chapters, the one on Gyöngyöspata, and I don't know how many of you can pronounce that word. It's kind of hard. Gyöngyöspata, Devecser, I think, is not so difficult. The work you did, especially in Devecser, was your own ethnographic work, and you did some also in Gyöngyöspata. I'm not going to get into this because this is not my neck of the woods. I don't do ethnographic work and so on, but I'm impressed that into a theoretical project of the kind that you developed, you bring in that type of research. In the New School, I always always criticize those who do only micro work. Well, you can't be criticized for that. This is a macro project. But on the other hand, I should be criticized for not doing sufficient amount of grassroots micro study of actually, what I wind up talking about. Well, you can't be criticized for that either because you actually were there, and no, it's not constructed like I'm sure your other work in the same area was constructed as ethnographic research with the reports and presenting the results of the questionnaires and so on. One can see how much you learn from your interlocutors throughout. And so this is the second stage of the argument. Now, this stage of the argument already leads to the question which Polanyi never solved, but he wants to solve on a micro level, namely, under what conditions this thing is exploited in an authoritarian way, and under what condition is the counter-movement of society at least block an authoritarian outcome. Gyöngyös is the place, Eastern Hungary, more impoverished. In a way, the segregation of the Roma is much more radical there. Their economic level is lower, I think, from what I'm learning from you. In that area, the exploitation, the right-wing exploitation, becomes more plausible because of the social structure of Magyar-Roma relations. I laughed Magyar because I always think, when you travel in this part of Hungary, is that it's full of other ethnic groups too, especially Slovaks. But at least when I was young, in the Matra region, a lot of people still spoke Slovak. So this, for me to think of Magyar as an ethnicity in a very strong sense is difficult. The Roma, too, you described through one of the chapters, are a pretty composite group. But let's leave it that way. Magyar-Roma relations, which is how the actors themselves perceive it, in Gyöngyös, they are relatively hostile, and it can be exploited more easily. Whereas in Debrecen, your other town, it looks like there are conflicts between some Roma groups and the Magyar population, but there are also conflicts within the Roma themselves and within the Magyar population. And in a way, the conflicts can be managed. Now, I'm not suggesting that Debrecen will then develop the positive dimension or the positive option for the second movement, because you don't tell such a happy story for that town either. But at least on the level of the grassroots conflict, which is not yet made by elites, but it is something which actually happens among people on the ground, Debrecen is in better shape. So now comes the third dimension of your analysis. I said there is a kind of social theorist using Polanyi. There's a second dimension, the ethnographer. And the third, which he doesn't, because he's such a good social scientist, and I'm more, happy also saying that I'm in politics, even when I do social science. He doesn't push that this has, of course, a political side too, right? And the political side has to do with what political actors do. And though you don't really tell us how that can be counteracted, or at least you don't do it systematically, one gets a kind of feeling that in Debrecen that was more successful also than in Gyöngyös. Now, what do these political actors do? I mean, Jobbik is the first important actor. This is the Movement for a Better Hungary. That's the translation of it. It's kind of funny for me to call a party Jobbik, but Lehet más a politika to me sounds a little awkward also. I'm very traditional, so I think of parties, they should have names like Democratic Party and Socialist Party and Ecological Party. But anyhow, that's not the trend in Europe, as many of you know. Jobbik is a young people's party that organizes itself around a racial ideology initially. Gypsy crime or Romani crime or Cigány bűnözés is the slogan, and they say, well, the state will do nothing about it. So they themselves come and they organize some vigilante actions, but mostly organize the the rhetoric of vigilantism. And to the extent that local authorities and local public figures, the press, and other opinion leaders collaborate with them, they become very powerful. What happens, I think, in Devonshire, from my reading of your other chapter, is that although they come and organize demonstration and organize a campaign against Roma crime, the local elites don't receive them with open arms. So there's a kind of resistance. Now, what struck me, and I will end with this part because this leads to the most interesting but the most questionable part too, is that it seems to me that those people who do this effectively in Devonshire, as against in Gyöngyöspata, where it's not done, are Fidesz people. They're Fidesz mayor and Fidesz partisans, and it is they who actually manage to at least defang the hard right. Now, I can understand in terms of Kristóf's broader thesis that this is, in a way, a diabolical and even winning strategy on one level, because while attacking the hard right, they absorb some of its message, especially when the hard right itself has shifted from racism to ultranationalism and immigrants became the main object of attack. Fidesz was really right there with them, if not before them already. So there is this cooperative dimension. The hard right, Orban is a master in this. I watched him over the years co-opt the smallholders and co-opt MIEP. So these right-wing parties in Hungary, which existed before and were usually led by very old people, became targets for Fidesz because my friends, unfortunately, some of them who were his advisors, told him that it's easy to displace those folk on the right who are stupid and bombastic and don't understand either Hungary or the external world. So they replaced those and displaced them. But what is amazing is that they did it to this young people's party too, or at least to a significant extent, they did it to them. And this has, on the one side, a positive result is that the views are civilized. For example, the one mayor you talk about, whose problem is with the, I don't know which is the Hungarian plural and which is the English plural, holmis, sounds to me English. Holmisok in Hungarian?
Lomis?
Holmis. So you say holmis in Hungarian too?
No. You're talking about the scrap or the used goods dealers. Lomis.
Lomis, I'm sorry, Lomis.
Yeah.
You see, holmi would be an equally good Hungarian term for it, but it's not. You know, in my day, they were called ószeres. See, I'm so old that that in Hungary, when this is an old thing in Hungary, collecting old stuff and reselling it. Every house in Budapest, you would have almost every day someone comes in and yells in the big yard, ószeres, használt ruhát, cipőt, mindent veszek. The same idea. The same idea. Now, these people are the wealthy Roma. These people are the wealthy part of the Roma community. And what this Fidesz mayor did was move them to a football stadium, a soccer stadium.
No, a former Soviet military.
I don't care. A former Soviet, Hungary has plenty of those because it has hardly an army, so you're not going to be able to fill those garrisons with Hungarian soldiers. But in any case, okay, a former Soviet, whatever it is. They were not happy to be sent there because business was good in town and everything else. In the end, they survived economically. But this actually, from a point of view of the Hungarian population, looked like doing something about the supposed Roma threat. And so in a way, this strategy, which was, now think about it, and I'll stop with this. What would be the approach then we would take if we were in power and try to block the hard right with the immigrants, right? How would we deal with the immigration issue? Where I think something similar would mean that that you would play the game of letting some in, not letting others in, making sure, it's like, and I'm sure this is done by some communities all over Europe. But what I'm asking is the political answer only to do a little what they already do, but don't do it quite as radically? Or is there going to be some other kind of political answer? Okay.
Thank you. We'll go through all the discussions and then we'll have a broad discussion.
I'm kind of tempted to summarize the book a little bit for folks who don't have familiarity with it, because it's a very good book, and I don't think that you have fully summarized it. Not that we can fully summarize it here. You have to read the book, and I will be shameless and promote the book. I'll ask him to promote his own book and pass around these things as well, because this book is just about to come out. So I'll try to be brief, but I want to summarize it also because Andrew's referring to a lot of things that happen in the book that you folks haven't had privy to. So I'm going to summarize it, and then I'll also make a few comments, some of them inspired by me trying to summarize this, and some of them inspired by what Andrew has put on the table. Kristóf argues himself that what he's trying to do in the book is to contribute to our understanding of right-wing hegemony in Hungary, as he said. And he claims to shed light on a popular, and I think he does, on a popular racist movement that took shape outside the party political arena in 2006 through 2010. So this is before, in a sense, the moment that Andrew's referring to, or it's happening. Well, part of what he's referring to is happening then. That was key to unmaking what he's calling the left liberal hegemony through its connection to right-wing political agendas, right? So there's this thing happening on the ground, and then there's the reaching in by the political right. At the same time that what has been basically the hegemonic force since 1990, if we look at just how many times they've been in power, is what is called in Hungary the liberal left. And that might need some unpacking for an American audience. I mean, it's something like what we call progressives here, but I think the history is important to understand. He argues that the dynamics are largely misunderstood, and that one of the things that has been misunderstood is the novelty of anti-Gypsyism, because people see it as an extension of prevalent racist sensibilities, prejudices, and patterns of treatment or so on, which misses what he argues is a crucial link between this anti-Gypsyism and what is a crisis of social reproduction, which he spoke about a bit, that's suffered by particular segments of the rural population, which he defines as the post-peasantry, in contrast to, but also suffering, what he calls the surplus population. And these are relatively, I'm going to say ethnicized instead of racialized, but into what Andrew was referring to as the Magyar population, which of course is made up of many different groups, and what we're calling here Gypsy population. He's talked a bit about that, and he says that this has to be understood in the context of transformations, capitalist transformations connected to global economic trends, which we don't talk about much here, but we should probably bring in at some point, and especially Hungary's accession to the EU. So when he was talking about de-agrarianization, actually already begins before 1990, actually, but kind of peaks in, I think, the lives of these people he's talking about with accession to the EU and the rearrangement of social relationships in the countryside, and especially the Northeast. So he says that the approaches that he's kind of critiquing fail to see how beyond fueling the rise of the far right and Yobi, it has also impacted mainstream politics and its role in the reconstruction of the state, which fuels and of course is then continued by Fidesz's rise to power in 2010. And another point, he also argues that there's a kind of broader effect on party political formations, which a number of people in this room have been part of. So he claims to fill the gap in by situating ideas about race and ethnicity within everyday relations, experience, and agency, which are shaped by these broader political and economic pressures. So here's the ethnographic part. But also identifying relational strategies and processes that are that connect these local sites of contention with that are, let's say, the results of social antagonisms or the effects of social antagonisms into regional and national political struggles. And that's really important because it's an argument about the scaling up of what work needs to go into the scaling up of these kind of localized experiences that actually Don Kalb then takes even further, but he gets it from you, actually. And Don Kalb argues that it can be scaled up now to the Visegrad scale, but inspired by you. So I think the scaling thing is actually really important in terms of thinking how these these events are playing out in Hungary, but in other places as well. So he argues and shows that we need to have an analytic space to identify the conditions of the emergence of racist movements and processes that shape these political trajectories. And I think here is one place where we can really think about how this study is also useful to the United States. So that's something that maybe we can return to later. So he highlights two key preconditions for the emergence of a racist counter-movement in Hungary. So here, counter-movement is referring to Polanyi's work, but I think on the scale still of localized counter-movements, but how they can be scaled up, I think is the way I read what you're saying here. So the first is what he's already mentioned, which is this double crisis of social reproduction. So of the largely non-Romani post-peasantry, and what he calls the ethnicized surplus population. So this is the depeasantization process, which I have some questions about that maybe I'll talk to you about later, just in terms of what kind of depeasantization process this is. And then the other is the effort of the ruling left liberal elites, he mentioned this as well, to emancipate the surplus population by disaggregating local mechanisms of segregation and control through the centralization of welfare and education programs, which generates in this deteriorating post-peasantry class feelings of anxiety that then can, and abandonment, which then can be racialized relationally. And again, he ties this to European integration, specifically the liberalization of trade, as well as the liberal technologies of emancipation of ethnic minorities. So that's also something that I think is really important that we can talk about more, and how this does work or doesn't work as a kind of liberal tenet. So these preconditions, he argues, also help explain why anti-Gypsyism couldn't gain so much traction as a generalized redemptive discourse. So Andrew talked a little bit about this, that in Devachet there's a kind of different potentiality, or the potentiality takes a different course than in Gyöngyös. And those are two different field sites that he studied, one of which is famous, Jane, you will remember this, for Jobbik going in with its paramilitary branch and starting up trouble. This was international news, the Gyöngyös event. So where Jobbik really gains traction, and Devachet, so Gyöngyös is in the northeast, and Devachet, which is in Transdanubia, it's kind of it's actually as far from it's actually right near the Austrian border. Let's say about a little over halfway from Budapest to the Austrian border, but a little more southerly. Because of, he argues, because of, at least he originally thought that because of economic and political opportunities there, that was the reason why Jobbik wasn't as successful there. But later on, you kind of revise your own argument, I think. So sorry, I wanted to give you a little bit of a picture of these places. So why it couldn't take hold as a generalized redemptive discourse, this anti-Gypsism. It couldn't be the main thing in rural regions where the double crisis was evaded, as in Devecser. So he then traces how Jobbik could suture together this nationwide moral panic, as he calls it, and how they managed to do that through a strategy of polarization, but then also how Fidesz is able to temper Jobbik's work and gather hegemony. And his argument is that Jobbik does that through the development of what's already developing in the socialist, the MSP period, the Hungarian Socialist parties, the formerly hegemonic left liberal parties' last rule, is the development of the dual state, which I'd love to ask more about, because in some ways it's very much like the current welfare states of Europe, but it's a furthering of that, through the development of so the turning of resources towards the development of a middle class, and I don't know, I'm not looking at notes here, but something like the punishment of claimants. So the shaming of claimants combined with the concentration of resources towards the middle class. Sorry, I didn't do a great job, but I'm sure you'll have more to say about that. Which he calls anti-egalitarian populism. So this is the development of a work-based society, which actually the workfare program, which is expanded under Fidesz, is started under MSP as an attempt to keep MSP voters, according to Kristóf. But also, I would argue, borrowing very much Jobbik's platforms. So the kind of law and order, workfare state, but of course Fidesz has the ability to actually enact that. So yeah, I'll stop there with the I hope that's a little bit more of a journey through his book. And there's the ethnography is excellent, and it's done in a really, he describes his methods quite a bit, and he's working also with another ethnographer of fame. But they're engaging in dialogues in these places, which I think if you look through the book and you see the diversity of the people that he's been able to discuss these things with, I think that's a very, it's an incredible achievement given the polarization, the political polarization in Hungary, which also has an urban-rural kind of polarization, that you were able to do that. So I do have a lot of questions, but some of them are really like nitpicky questions, so maybe I'll leave those for later and go over some of the bigger questions that come to mind. The first is that I'm a big fan of the Helyzet Public Working Group, and so I'm borrowing a little bit of some of their analysis here. They're really concerned with the way in which a kind of liberal versus illiberal framing has taken over Hungarian political life to the degree that we can't really see beyond that. And one of the concerns then is, how do you build up a left or a liberal left if there's this dichotomy that's so strong when the liberal left as such is in shambles. So it seems to me that one of the questions we have in terms of this undermining of the quote-unquote liberal left, and we can talk more about what that even means, is the question that is the global condition, and this is something that Hayzat, of course, focuses on a lot, is the situation of global capitalism and Hungary's situation in it. So a question I have is, don't we need to think more? Because you bring it in as a question, but the question of uneven development in the world capitalist system is here, also in terms of the possibilities for even a social democratic left, which we might call a liberal left in Hungary, because that's what has been attempted in these last couple of decades for the most part, how it could possibly enact policies that would be able to change these conditions. And that's a much larger question of scale, not just because of the EU, but because of what people tend to call now, neoliberalism. But the conditions for actually, the MSP, one of its biggest problems, with all of its failures, one of its biggest problems towards the end of its reign is that it can't keep borrowing money in order to do what it's doing, which is still not solving this problem in the countryside, right? Or it's maybe even making it worse because of the way that it's arranged. So it seems to me that there's this larger problem that we see across Europe, but not just in Europe, of the fact that even the center left is really unable to act like a left. There are too many economic constrictions on its activity to be able to do that. And I think that's a real question that we have to ask. And then I think another one is that, I've been kind of following some of the new interests of the liberal left in Hungary to pay attention to the people, if you will, although it's not, the people, let's call it. But there's not really, the issue is that people don't really identify as working class very much, right? So what is that way that you can actually start thinking about the broader population, some kind of formation that would not be ethnically exclusive in the way that Jobbik and Fidesz are kind of farming things up, right? So these are questions that I think you've thought about a lot, but I'm wondering if you can talk about a little bit more. And then there's this, there's a question of left liberal, which I think is maybe something that we could talk about more. It's used all over Hungary, so it's not you inventing it, but I wonder if we'd want to disaggregate left and liberal and see what happens. But then now I want to talk more about the right. So it seems to me when we think about from a longer, Jobbik isn't that old, but it does predate the Gyöngyöspata event, right? But it also seems to me that it's not quite clear that Fidesz certainly won these elections. There's no question about that. But Jobbik has more seats in parliament than it ever had before. It's now the second most popular party in Hungary, if we, count that by votes, right? So it seems to me that the dance between Fidesz and Jobbik is a much more complex dance. And Orbán's coming out ahead, and he's also, the electoral rules are also in the favor of large parties. But it seems to me that dance, and I think that you point to this in the book, the dance actually has to be continually danced. It's not over yet. So I just wanted to bring in some of the other things, some of which are noted in the book and some of which have been noted elsewhere, but just in that kind of broader dance, what we're looking at, there's what you talk about quite a bit in the book is the kind of anti-gypsy strategy and how that turned out maybe not to be the appropriate strategy for a nationwide approach, and how Fidesz kind of took advantage of that when Jobbik seemed too radical. But there's the question of Trianon trauma, which you bring up in the book and is present there, but certainly didn't start since 2010 or even 2006, right? There have been movements, and I'm thinking about the 64 Vármegye, how do you translate that, counties movement that is now very tight with Jobbik. So there are these other kind of strands, and that includes also, of course, the granting of citizenship by Fidesz to over-the-border Hungarians and their role in the elections. So there are these other strands that seem to me that are kind of coming together. So migration has already been mentioned, right? The anti-migrant movement, or production of a crisis, and then the solution of that crisis. There's the anti-Brussels discourse, which seems to have been very useful for Fidesz, which is not necessarily anti-EU, because Fidesz relies on EU funds for its clientelist networks to reproduce them, as far as I understand. But then there's also, I'm thinking about like the current claims that Jobbik is going center, so that maybe it wants to play the other side of the dance as Orbán seems to go further right. But there have been people who work on and claim, like people like Adam Fabri, who claim that much of Jobbik's votership from the beginning were people that responded to its attack on neoliberal capitalism. So people are saying that Jobbik's moving center because they're approaching Jewish leaders and, taking stock of their supposedly immature younger days and so on. But that's not about policies so much as it is a kind of representational, especially around ethnicity and race, that seems to be the moderation that's going on. And then finally, I think back to the question of liberalism as a whole, which of course you really begin with by referring to Polanyi, right? Because Andrew called it globalization, and it is certainly that too, but it's a liberal globalization and now a neoliberal globalization that we're talking about. So it's a marketization of society, if we want to say, there's many other things that are going on. But I think the question of liberalism and what it means is another thing that Fidesz is playing with. And and then just another thing that I think, you brought it up, but I think that Orbán's economics are really important. So the people that get all upset in the mainstream press, they keep on saying unorthodox economics, and that's actually really important because you can call out the left and you can call out the right in one swipe of the hand by saying it's unorthodox, which basically means it's not neoliberal. So I think that unpacking that is really useful, and I think that the policies that you've pointed to are useful to seeing what's actually going on. But that popularity is maybe tenuous because there is the production of a surplus population. So from what I understand, workfare is one of the main reasons why employment has gone up, even though most of it is part-time. And there have been other kinds of manipulations of the employment rate. And then I'm also thinking about, recently I read an article by Mihai Koltai, where he points out that there's a German magazine that did an article that said that, that German corporate investors in Hungary would be very happy, are very happy with the status quo. And this has to do with the strategic arrangements by which subsidies are going. So as much as there's been a kind of pushback against transnational capital in certain sectors, there's still a great amount of subsidy going to transnational corporate actors in the country, while at the same time there is, there's an undoing of much of the social infrastructure, education and so on, as well as the reduction of, the part of the dual state argument, right? The reduction of welfare apparatus in general. So I'll leave there. I could ask you lots of nitpicky things, but these are just things that inspired me to think more about, and I'd love to hear more from you about.
So maybe we can give you like a short amount of time, Christoph, to address some of these and then go to the, or do you want to?
I'm slightly concerned that our discussion is going to fall apart. So I mean,
You
what
want
if
to
what if we like let the audience ask a couple of questions
Okay.
about what's not clear, because I think we were a bit all over the place.
Yes, I think
And maybe building on the dynamic, I'll answer some of these questions. But I'm just slightly
Why don't
worried what people understood from all of this, because
Well-
it's complicated, and we're talking about the past and the present, and there are questions about the future. So like, could you just say what was unclear, perhaps? Something I could say, or we could talk
well,
more
maybe
about?
people could ask questions.
Yeah,
Just generally.
exactly.
Why don't we open it to, because since we're a small group here, we should open it to
And then,
general
and then I'm
discussion.
happy to come back to all of this. I'm not escaping the question.
We could give one of these, let's, and
Like,
then hand it around. It doesn't have to be a question answer. It can be more like discussion or general questions. Not like when they make you stand up for 3 minutes and say, it has to have a question at the end. Any points of view?
Or really just clarifying questions.
Oh, not, okay.
I was hoping not to start.
Well, I saw your name, I saw your hand first. But then-
It was before me.
Did Jane, did you have your hand up?
No.
I looked at her. Okay. But once we give it to Don, then he'll talk. So let's give it to a few people who talk less, and then we'll come
Sure, I'm not
back
gonna
to
talk. Just ask, what's your, building on the book, what's your best case scenario for the next 4 years, and what's your worst case scenario?
Do you want to take some questions and then we'll come
Yeah,
back
sure,
to you?
whatever.
And if you don't have time, you don't have to answer.
anyone over on this side? We can put the mic to you.
Okay, Don. Oh, Jane has her hand.
Jane, you're right.
Give her the mic.
When communities.
Wait,
fall-
hold on to the mic for the tape.
When communities fall apart, what does that look like in terms of health and marriage and family and possibly addiction?
So how do communities fall apart? Yeah, it's a good.
Okay, now hand it back. No?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I think, having not read the book, so I can say this with clear conscience, that this is really one of the most important books. And analysis, and we discussed it before in the AAA to some degree. So just a comment and then a thought. First of all, I think the strength of the analysis is the way in which you base it on political economy. I really think this is important because the analyses which I read on populism, like say Jan Verdamuller and so on, talking about morality and so forth, really don't come to grips with the driving forces here. The importance of the austerity package in '95, the Bucharest package. Bucharest, absolutely crucial, I think, for the discrediting of the liberal left, which I frankly speaking, think it will never recover from, but it's not in my lifetime, it may not be so long. Right? But I think the left is firmly stamped in the image of the population as a whole, is my sense, with the view that this is an austerity left, it's a pro-German Christian Democrat left, it's an IMF left, it's not a Hungarian left, it's not for the people in any sense. It's carrying on Merkel and European Central Bank's agenda. And this is really a pivotal political event and has had lasting consequences, I think. I don't see any shift in that. So from that point of view, I think your pessimism is justified. There's another fact I wanted to mention, which is the Chinese who are now becoming more and more important for Hungary, I think, and this kind of, how do you call it? It's not anti-capitalism, it's anti-neoliberal capitalism, as Mary said. It's an extremely interesting political economic formation because it's resisting a certain type of capitalism while adhering and championing to another type. It's really an interesting form, which I don't think, if I have a criticism, I don't think that this has been theorized enough in the book or anywhere else for that matter, because it's really a post-2008 phenomenon, speaking globally, following the crisis, and where people could see an anti-capitalist thing coming from the left, at least some parts of the left, and see a sort of Obama liberalism from the sort of center, right, center, left. But this particular thing, I think, needs some further analysis, some further thought, and the significance, of course, is way beyond the boundaries of Hungary, to put it mildly. I wanted to ask you a bit about the left, right? Because to me, this is really the problem. Right? I mean, Hungary has a very strong, I'm not sure you make enough of this, I don't mean, Hungary has a very strong right-wing authoritarian tradition, which is not new. You know, you want to go back to the 20s and so on, and even before, in a way, you could argue this is actually, the liberal thing was the deviation from the norm, not really the trajectory of the country, in a way. And then the communist period is another sort of deviation, and in a funny way, Hungary has returned to its normal state of apartheid. But the left, Hungary also has had historically extremely strong left tradition. I mean, Potentiality and anti-fascism, an extremely long list, right? But it seems unable to put forward an economic and social program, which was convincing, or around which the population would mobilize. Could you say a little bit about the non-neoliberal left, is what I'm asking, and the role it could play, or is it non-existent, or what? Because I think this is really a crucial issue, globally speaking, in the US as well, right? And one of the debates we have flying around here in this building, we have outstanding, indeed, or famous colleagues who are well-known Keynesians, right? And who confidently put forward a neo-Keynesian perspective in famous newspapers and so on. Right? And many of us feel that this won't cut it. You know, it just won't. And the question of how do you go beyond that sort of Keynesian, and in a way, Polanyi, in a way, perspective. And how does the left develop an economic and social program which addresses the issues which the right is addressing? Right? I mean, so I wanted to really throw that out, and also congratulate on one last thing, which is bringing out how internationalist the right is in comparison to the left. The right turns out to be much more internationalist as a practical matter than the left. So it's very interesting. Congratulations, excellent work.
I just wanted to make a comment about the non-neoliberal left, because we know them very well, because we know all of them name by name. Probably it's as big as a couple of hundred people in Hungary. So we know them really well. They're not much bigger.
Oh, we have one here. Yeah, we can leave that one there. I'm just going to ask a question from the non-floor. I was wondering, that one's working.
The one up there is working.
So I thought, you know, having followed your work over the last year, I got a really good sense of the relationship between the Roma or the Gypsies and the issues of social reproduction. and you kind of outlined it again here with, which reminds me, and you mentioned it, Ali Hochschild talking about our, Louisiana, because it's this question of, and also where I worked in Brooklyn, very similar kind of things, of a group such as the Roma being given a certain amount of affirmative action or some kind of assistance as the poorest group by a liberal government, and then other groups that are being affected this way by agriculture decline, but if we're talking about the US or you'd be talking about industrial, deindustrialization or lack of jobs to a certain extent. And so the groups that are better off but are losing in the overall economy to a certain extent are very resentful. And that's the issues of social reproduction that I think you talk about with the Roma, as I understand it. But then I'm not sure, I think you said, and I think Andrew said, that really nationally, the immigration is really the issue that has been most successful for the right-wing rhetoric. Recently, yes. Yes, for
That
this
came
round.
after the Gypsies.
Yeah, so I didn't hear how or if that also on the ground is related to certain issues, or if you see that more as a rhetorical discourse that Jobbik or Orban picks up on. But I didn't hear the same kind of argument for why immigration would be so successful on a national level as I thought your very interesting argument about why anti-gypsies is successful in the places where it was successful. And we understand very well about the IMF, in relation to the agriculture and the competition. The whole thing kind of works, at least as I've read it or heard you talk, but I didn't hear such a grounded argument, and maybe it isn't. Maybe what you're talking about with immigration is sort of like what Stuart Hall talked about with policing the crisis. It's a moral panic created by the media or the judges about crime, but it isn't, we don't have the same dense interrelation with the people who are, it's a discourse rather than a on-the-ground battle. And I'm interested in that being so effective then. It's not an economic argument.
So, thanks. Those are a number of really interesting questions. I'll start from the end. So why does immigration work in a country where there is like a couple thousand refugees and everyone else has moved to Germany and Sweden? Yes, I think the answer is, so my analysis of anti-Gypsyism is that it's a bottom-up orchestrated moral panic. It swells from the bottom. It is used by political entrepreneurs to scale up and make it into a politics, give it a thrust. And the thrust that it is given is to deal the final blow to the left in 2008-9. It's the final blow in the carcass of the left. The left had already been weakened in 95 by austerity politics, and people remember that. My old informants still remember at that time. But the thing that really struck them was that the left has become the party of the gypsies. There's a discourse of the Democrats becoming a party of minorities and the cosmopolitan elite. So I think Hochschild's analysis is interesting here because there's this concept of a deep story. People have a deep story that they tell about themselves. I mean, particularly situated people have different deep stories. And the deep story that Hochschild writes about in Louisiana of Tea Party activists resembles a lot the deep story of my post-peasant informants. That deep story is we're working our asses off to get from A to B to C to D, make a bit more money so we don't have to struggle at the end of the month, and we're barely advancing in life. Our children we can barely allow ourselves to send our children to university. And then you have the state putting people ahead of us in the line, people who are obviously different from us and we're lazy motherfuckers. Sorry, that's the word they use, that you're really angry with this. And so they see themselves, the story is people jumping the line with the help of elites. And the story is really powerful because they see their school transforming and being gypsified, as they say. And that really killed the left, because the right immediately took advantage of that and spun that deep story into a politics, into an exclusionary politics. So that's why I focused on this in the book, because that's what killed the left in Hungary. An already sick left. Why do I say it's left liberal? I say it's left liberal because there hadn't been a true left after communism, of course. I mean, there was a terrible heritage to deal with. A lot of people had nostalgia towards that regime. But nevertheless, the way transition worked out, and the fact that it was unfortunately from '94 the left that had to introduce austerity, totally changed the meaning of what the left was in people's eyes, and that just stuck to the left. So that from that point on, that stigma was there, and that's one of the reasons, Andrew, that we called our party not a leftist party, but a politics can be different.
No, I understand.
Because that heritage, it's part of the struggle with that heritage, what to do with it. But the immigration issue differs from this. So that's a top-down orchestrated moral panic using propaganda and the fact that Fidesz controls almost the whole of the media space. So, and especially if you live in a village, you only have access to public radio. You don't read the internet if you're above a certain age. And you're being hammered with messages, with images of George Soros sending the refugee army into Hungary. And that sticks. Because you're sitting in a bar, you're not even listening, but you see Soros' face come up every 10 minutes, month after month. It sticks after a while, especially when there's no alternative discourse. And the left.
Do we need the rest of the contradictions? Do we really need anything else but the discourse? If that's all that it took, you could say that Trump can just come out with what he's saying.
Of course it's not enough, but when Orban is very clever, and Fidesz's propagandists always coming back to this discredited left and grafting new and new elements of what they would do. Again, the billboards that we saw was that the left was going to let all of the refugees in. And that reminded people of all the horrors that the left had done, so it made sense to them. The leftist politicians, whatever is the left, right, so socialists and liberal parties, they had no chance of countering that. And people who but I think we still need a more thorough analysis. That's what I want to end on with the immigration issue, that this is all very new. We're still in shock in Hungary about what happened in the elections and how well this anti-immigrant discourse works. So I think we still need more digging. But for instance, let me just give you an example. People in my field side, that village, the gypsies told me through Facebook, Messenger, when I was already here, we're afraid of the immigrants coming and being housed in our houses. And I was shocked to hear that. I was like, in your shabby houses, the refugees, wow. And then there was another story of my local Roma informants not wanting to send their children to a trip to the capital city because they would be raped by refugees. So I didn't know what to respond to that, to be frank. I just thought that, there is really a moral panic that has been very successfully orchestrated, and we still need to understand how that was so successful. But there's a lot of politics of fear that's going on, so I guess it's just another element of that. Hungary is in a state of paranoia, the whole society is. So I guess that works. So that's about anti-Gypsyism and immigration and how those are different types of panics.
If I could say something just on that. It certainly makes sense. What you say is that one is bottom up and the other is top down. Of course, there is a top down part also of the bottom up and the Gypsy thing you described it. But I think that actually the two are related to one another, because in a way, what people are being told that this left-wing or social liberal or left liberal, these are all bad terms, by the way, because it doesn't explain really very much what the Hungarian parties and the Hungarian political groupings have been. But what they say, here I guess we could put it this way, they're all Rawlsian, because they are always concerned about the least well off, but they don't care about the one who is a level above them. And the Roma are the least well off. course, obviously in your story, there's some Romas who are better off than a lot of non-Romas, but still, they're regarded as the least well off, and that's what the liberal elite helps. And now these immigrants, they want to do the same again. So in a way, it's built, the top down is built on a foundation of the bottom up already. That's the point I wanted to make. And I think that's the point your book makes, because the book in the end gets to this immigration thing. You don't really discuss it fully because the book was concluded earlier. But that's the argument of your book, that of course there are other dimensions, because the hyper-racism of Jobbik had perhaps too narrow a support system. So in a way, to turn to ultranationalism becomes also a way of broadening their base. But ultranationalism can't just be stuck with the Roma as the relevant underclass. So of course, the immigrants, well, there were some in Hungary, so it's not as if Hungary didn't have a very brief period of immigration crisis. But mostly it's on TV, they see it all over Europe. And they say, these liberal elites, Soros becomes symbolic of them, they want to be roles in. They want to help these people who are really the weakest, which means that we're forgotten. We're the forgotten men and women.
Yeah, that's a very important point that you're making. It's a good way to put it as a Rawlsian left. There's many ways to put it. I haven't heard that expression, but I think it's imaginative.
Not too many of them, of course.
No, you're right. That's just the way. That's the way that I'll use the word left liberal or progressive politics in Hungary was built. That was its structure. And the Alliance of Free Democrats was the party that actually gave the ideology of the transition.
Exactly.
And they're the ones who brought this in, that we have to care most about Roma, and there were good reasons for that.
Because we can't do the other thing anyway. We do have to have austerity. So what do we do in austerity?
Exactly. So
they still must support the worst off.
This is what I want to come to. The thing I was struggling in the book when I was thinking about a left-wing renewal in Hungary is there's a deep problem of fiscal capacity on the EU's periphery, and here I'm getting to Don's point. It's just built into the way the periphery functions, and the state is necessarily weak fiscally, because these are competitive economies that are competing for German and other investments, and it's a downward race. So the states are competing with each other to offer more tax rebates to the multinational companies. Please bring your engine production here and not to Slovakia. And Orban is actually driving that race to the bottom. Now we have the lowest tax rate for capital, foreign investment in the EU, as far as I know. We are even below Ireland. So that leaves, the problem with that is, this is what I write in the epilogue of the book, that you can't do middle class formation, which is Fidesz's politics. Fidesz has not abandoned its old politics. It just used to be it's not as open as it used to be. It used to be called the, polgár. So the word bourgeois and citoyen, it means the same. It's the same word in Hungarian. And this used to be the catchphrase of Fidesz to describe its project. It's to build a middle class in Hungary. Middle class that has its back straight, that is autonomous. The project now is, well, actually we don't need the autonomy part, but we do need it. The idea is to build a middle class, and there simply isn't enough fiscal capacity, so money, to do poverty alleviation. So what do? So we send the police, and we keep those people down because there's nothing else we can do. And the problem is that I think that's correct. That although I shed tears for that, I see what that does for people's lives. It's tragic. It's lives lost, it's generations lost. It would be very hard if anyone came to power in Hungary to actually do those two things, to support the middle class and to alleviate poverty and to start social mobility again. I don't think there's enough money. I'm not an economist, but I haven't heard economists rebuking that argument in a way that speaks to me or that I find convincing. So I think that's like a deep structural issue. That's one of the reasons that I think the problem can only be solved on the European scale. And unfortunately, I'm a pessimist because we're moving away from a concept of social Europe, which would mean extra investment with German, Swedish money on the periphery, towards a different kind of Europe in which we'll probably have lesser money to redistribute, because now German taxpayers are asking, should we finance authoritarianism? Like, no, we probably shouldn't, so let's give less money to Orban. And I think that's a tragic mistake that we're about to make. It's understandable because it would make perhaps the regime slightly less or weaker, but at the same time, I think it would just reproduce the problems at the bottom that are driving this process, if you see what I mean. So I'm pretty pessimistic on that, I have to say. I want to say a couple of words, about, and I won't forget Lili, but about, so what is this anti-neoliberal capitalism? What is this project? And I'm not an economist, but I think I'm trying to understand parts of this new regime, so I can't do the whole analysis. We need economists to do that. I have a very good friend who's called Gabor Scheining, who some of you know, and he's doing great research on that. I think he's going to write a book in a year or two that's going to be dealing with the economics of that. And so we are in discussion since decades, and we were on the same party, and in the Green Movement before, so I know his thinking, I know what he's writing. I'm drawing on him now. He, building on others, basically analyzes the policy of Fidesz as it's a very clever balancing act between promoting the interests of certain domestic capitalists, the ones who are not in productive sectors, so the ones who are mostly, it's, like giving a tobacco monopoly, for instance, to cronies of the regime, or it's also less taxes to be paid by small Hungarian enterprises, so a tax alleviation there. It's also renationalization of public services and of utilities, and then using that as a tool to decrease utility prices for the poor. So it's a number of those measures that promote certain components of the domestic capitalist class and give some sweeteners to the lower middle class, to workers at the same time. And that's the economic protectionist policies that really are effective politically. At the same time, the government is helping the multinational companies that are already in Hungary by decreasing their tax burden even more. So the German companies, the article was very important, they're extremely happy, and they're telling Merkel, don't push Orban too much, because we're happy with what he's doing in Hungary. Like, we're doing well. So there's a clever mix. Orban knows exactly how to balance between the interests of the domestic capitalists and multinational corporations. And at the same time, he's weakened the labor code, making it, labor more flexible. He has introduced a workfare policy that basically pushes the idle back into work. So that's how it's a regime that seeks to extract extra work from society, extra effort, longer work hours, lesser protections. Also, money has been taken out from key healthcare and educational services. That's how community collapse looks like. I can say more about that. But it's a mix of elements of economic policies that we didn't think could hang together before, because part of them look very rightist, liberal, libertarian rightist, and part of them look almost leftist, populist. And they work together in a way that appears to be extremely successful, politically successful. On the long run, I think if we were going to look at Hungary 20 years ago, we're going to see a society depleted of its strength and resources, and it's a poor country, there's no natural resources. The socialists left to the new capitalism pretty healthy people with pretty high education, and we've been preying on that. But what this regime is doing is not reinvesting into people. So I think 20 years down the line, this is going to be a very sad country with sick people, many of them uneducated. And that's pretty tragic, but it looks like that's the trajectory that we're in, and I don't see how the periphery could really move out of that. I mean, to be fair, some other countries are doing better with similar policies. So Slovakia is doing better than Hungary. In that regards, I have to maybe say, let's look at what the Slovaks are doing that Hungarians are not doing, I don't understand that enough. But there's a conundrum there that Hungary appears to be even worse than the other countries in the region, but everyone is struggling and everyone is being pushed in a framework and in a channel that Hungary has actually paved. So it's not like the Poles are going in a totally different direction or Slovaks. There's a merger of the Visegrad countries in a way, as Don rightly remarked. So that's about the anti-neoliberal capitalism that is being, and it's an authoritarian form, right? Because you need to force people into work. And I'm just reading Orwell's Road to Big and Pier, 1930s. I mean, a lot of things that I see in Hungarian rural areas remind me to some extent of that. Of course, it's not that bad. It's not, Orwell writes about mine workers. And the extremely harsh labor regime there. We're not there, but there's a reason why Orban calls this the work-based society. That's his ideological term. That resonates a lot with the experience of my informants. Actually, the term was proposed by mayors in the Northeast under left liberal rule to say to the elite, hey, stop what you're doing, we need to move towards a different kind of regime. And they called it, we need a work-based society, we need to go back to a work-based society, otherwise our morals, our communities will fall apart, we need a centripetal force in society, and that needs to be work. And Orban picked that up and made a whole strategy out of it, a whole economic and political strategy out of it. So that's the cornerstone of the anti-neoliberal capitalism that is being built. There's a number of other questions, but I mean, I can't answer all of them. But maybe understand what's unorthodox in this, because it's a mixture of components that don't hang together usually. I think it's interesting from a US perspective to look at the new Republican Party, I mean Trump, and how he's trying under Bannon to use some of those ideas. I'm not saying they're only drawing on Orban. They're in strong, really intense relationship with the Front National too, I know that for a fact. But there is this similar idea of like economic protection. Let's make the Republican Party veer a bit more towards economic protectionism and not be only the party of the rich, and that could be a winning new strategy for middle America. So I don't know if that will work. I don't know enough about this country, but I think it's an interesting idea that they're using and promoting. And if I was a Democrat, I would be unsure that the Democrats are going to win the next presidential election at this point in time. Okay, so I want to hand over the floor for comments. I've talked too much, but maybe these like what's the worst and best case scenario?
I think you talked about the worst a bit.
I talked about the worst. I think
country, but like maybe best case scenario for the left, like taking in everything that you think and looking inside and.
Well, as you hear, like I think there's a problem, like there's a structural problem undermining the left, and I don't see a solution to that yet.
No best case. Because
there's no national level solution. We're in that kind of situation of geopolitical situation. This is why like Hayzet and the whole world system analysis is relevant. Like in the US, I think there's options, right? Because there's still much more money here, and you can tax actually production, and you have the chance to like rethink your trade. Well, Hungary doesn't have that. Like trade, well, that's like ingrained in the European treaties. There's nothing. It's a free trade regime. Point. There's nothing we can change about that. You can play with monetary policy to some extent because we still have the forint. The countries being whipped into the euro won't even have that. So I think it's extremely difficult to propose or promote a left-wing project. All I can say is on an ideological level, it's going to have to be populist. Populist in the sense, okay, so who's going to lose from this regime? We see the losers. The losers are the people who are below the lower middle. The left needs to convince them and show them that really you're the losers of this regime. It needs to say, look, you're being distracted with all the anti-immigrant talk. There's always these scare tactics, always looking for new enemies. That's Orban's political strategy. Gypsies before, now immigrants. It's going to be now it's the NGOs that are coming up. It's Soros, always a new enemy.
That was the homeless.
Jews.
The homeless, Jews, well yeah, Soros is a Jew, so you don't even have to, everyone knows, right? So you can play on anti-Semitism. It's a very, that's part of this, that's the strategy, politically speaking. The left needs to explain to the lower middle class, you're losing materially. And it's going to have to do a number of other things to convince them that it will not promote austerity. At this point in time, although I really think, my heart is with the immigrants and the refugees, like it's politically suicidal to say let immigrants in at this point. So that's why the left is not saying we're destroying the wall on Hungary's southern border, but they have kind of accepted it. When you're pushed in a corner, that's what you have to do. But so it's going to have to be populist, and it's going to have to speak to those down and out, the 3 million who are objectively losers materially. No other way around it. And in the cities, the liberal side will have to reconstruct itself because the populism won't win over the liberals. And those who, could be on board with some kind of tamed capitalism based on the argument that at least it's not going to be so ugly, it's not going to produce this kind of ugly identity politics. So the society could be more equal, and the atmosphere of paranoia and hatred could go away. I think that could speak to people in cities, because we're suffering from it, right? And to say that, we're not going to destroy the market since we don't have a communist project anymore anyway, so why don't we find some common ground between those constituencies? That's the only thing that can break this apart, I think. That kind of alliance, but how to do it, how to build it, where the money's going to come from, where the people are going to come from, I have no clue. It's not a lot of people. So I'm sorry, that's a very pessimistic note, I know.
Okay, there's a few more questions.
Yeah.
Let me give you the mic. I think this one's working.
I was just wondering about the gender dimensions of what's going on, because I was thinking of across Europe, there's clearly been, and people noticing that women are much more likely to offer cosmopolitan hospitality to refugees. So, and I remember seeing images of women beside the Hungarian highway handing out bottles of water. And I was thinking, there's obviously very complex connections to your complex assemblage. I mean, you've got moral panics, moral projects, top-down moral projects, and so on. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of that. I mean, some people have actually seen hope in that, in the gender dimensions. I'm thinking, obviously, I don't want to make myself comparisons to the US, but there is an interest in how gender has come to the fore in sort of anti-Trumpism. So,
Let's have one more question because it's already 8:30. And
Oh, it is?
Yes. Did you have your hand up behind?
So my question's a little hypothetical, so I don't know how easy it is to answer, but in your opinion, what do you think the consequences of using such anti-Gypsy rhetoric as a form of political leverage? What could the consequences of that be? Because I know anti-Roma rhetoric is nothing new in Europe, but when you look at, I think I'm just asking this question because I'm doing a lot of research on Serbia right now, and you see how when sort of the ethnic card is played, that really quickly gets out of hand. So, I mean, do you see in Hungary, even more systematic discrimination taking place? Do you see it being sort of a rolling ball that could get out of hand, or do you think it's just sort of something that's used for the election and you don't see it getting much, much worse?
I'm going to answer the second one first. Not that the first one is not interesting. I'll come back to that. That's fascinating, actually. Please have a look at the book, is the bad answer I can give, because I actually look at how the birth of political led to the transformation of the state in a rightward direction. And what that means in very summary, generalistic terms is that the state has been turned and used to reward those worthy, the good Hungarians, the hardworking Hungarians. It's not ethnically, mentioned that these are Hungarians, not Roma, but there is a return of the state to its rightful owners under Fidesz. And there are policies of de facto segregation and money being taken out of social services that could promote social mobility, and a discourse against idling and against the parasites. And a regime, a state, that is bifurcated into one part of the state caters more to those up and the middle, the core of society, the mainstream society, and their second-class citizenship and state functions to police the crisis and the populations who have suffered from anti-Gypsyism, both systemic and political. It's the short answer. Look at the book. There's a whole chapter on that. But so there are systemic effects of that politics inbuilt into the way the state functions and everyday relations function. I mean, I feel that when I worked with Roma in rural Hungary in the 2006-2000 period. I've criticized a lot the left liberal camp here, and the book, is a lot of the book is a criticism of the strategies being promoted there. But there was a wind that I, as someone who was promoting grassroots community projects, could still use, a wind that was blowing from the center, from the government, that I could use to work with Roma and promote their interests. That is impossible to do in this regime. And it's hard for me to explain exactly how that works, but the way the state has been put together and that social relations work makes that impossible these days. So you can't do progressive community projects in most parts of Hungary these days. Just to give you one example. So I helped the local Roma community put together a cucumber growing cooperative in the Northeast. And that cooperative collapsed when Fidesz came to power, not directly as a result of the policies, don't get me wrong, for another reason. But there was no way of rebuilding that cooperative. Why? Because of the public works program, the workfare program sucked people away from that program. And they told me, like, now we've got a state-run public works program. Yeah, it's not our cooperative anymore, and we're told what to do by our non-Roma superiors, the mayor. But it's equally stable, and it pays a bit less, but we're fine with this. And anyway, what do you want us to do against this? You see the wind blowing against, the wind turning? Well, that's what I meant. And I could theorize that and be, more abstract, but read the book for that if you want more abstract ideas about that. Yes, so what I think gender is the next enemy in Hungary. I have a very good friend women are the next enemy. But they're not going to be talked about as the enemy, but as Orbán actually already after the election a couple of days ago said that he wants to strike a pact with Hungarian women because there's a demographic problem in Hungary. There aren't enough children, and women between 25 and 35 need to have more children. Patriarchy and reinstating patriarchy is going to be a key element of this fourth Orbán government because part of their thinking is that a nation is strong when it is economically competitive and when it has demographic advantages over its neighbors, but at least it's not losing people. So you thought I would be more optimistic, but I gave you another really pessimistic thought. But that's what's coming. That's what's coming. I mean, it's clear. I just thought I was going to be the next minister. And Orbán said, your job is this. It's to make women reproduce more. It was almost as blunt as that. And I'm just hoping that women are going to react in the same way that the Polish women did when that right-wing government tried to, basically almost make abortion impossible in the country. And there's a huge women's movement in Poland. So I'm hoping that there will be a similar reaction. It's going to be confined to the cities because we've lost the countryside for reasons I explain in the book. But at least it's going to be a start for was something that the left is in disarray. The left is not in disarray. The left is dead right now. It's on the floor. I mean, sorry. I mean, I think we should end soon, but and I'm sure I would have more pessimistic thoughts to share, but I'll spare you of that. But I mean, a couple of you are seeing on Facebook, people in the left, what's happening to them. It's terrible. Like, there's infighting, everyone's blaming the other for this tragic result. People are self-validating, and at the same time saying, where should we leave? So it's a pretty bad situation. Maybe in a year's time, there'll be more room for optimism, because there'll be maybe some counter movements against this very right-wing counter movement. But it's very
across Europe.
Of course.
Deeply implicated in this whole immigration panic, isn't it? Because you've got
Yes.
places like Italy, which are very, very small.
Yes.
It's actually a critical factor.
Yeah. Yeah, but this new politics, this is the next element of it.
Yeah. Sorry.
Where's the microphone?
We're
We're recording, Don. Can
Oh,
you
you're
wait?
recording. All right. Sorry. Thanks. What is to stop the left?
Sorry?
What is stopping the left from taking a harder stance against some of the neoliberal elements which remain in Orban's policy? I mean, why could the left say, okay, we need to increase taxes against the Germans, are part of the local bourgeoisie, and we need to redistribute this money to the group, that middle group or that strategic group and so on? What is actually preventing the left from taking a harder position against liberal economics? This is what I don't. I know the constraints, and you're absolutely correct about. I mean, the reprisal from Germany, Greece, is there for everybody to observe. But it's a very interesting example, which cuts in. The Greek example cuts in different ways, by the way. But why I don't understand, why is it, let me put it as, are there people on the left who are taking this position, which is saying that Hungary must tax the Hungarian rich more, this money must go to rural areas, to rural development, this is where we stand, right? The Germans don't like it, well, to hell with them, and so on. Are there forces on the left in Hungary, which is taking a sort of, let's call it a left nationalist position, in a way, on economic policy, not on what immigration now?
It seems to me, I mean, it's civil society.
Can you just wait for this so that your question actually will be part of the recorded dialogue? Thanks.
Thanks, Kristóf. Just congratulations on the book, first and foremost, and thank you so much for the presentation. So is just kind of connected to this is also, it's just like, is the issue just like civil society in Hungary is just like not around? Is that part of the reason that the leftists can't grow? It's because there's no civil society? And like, what is that? Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of curious around that, because I feel, I'm scared for also, I mean, someone mentioned this earlier, but I think I'm also scared for, this is a right-wing phenomenon that's going throughout the world, and media consolidation and all these different aspects of where the left can actually grow. So I'm just curious if the church, where's the church at? You know, like where's the anything? Like where's that at? That's what I'm specifically kind of curious about as well.
Yeah, good questions. So Don, yes, there was actually the Socialist Party's prime ministerial candidate had that kind of left populist line. His billboard said, "Tax the rich." He didn't talk about Germany, but there was clearly this idea of taxing the higher middle class and capital, and using that to rebuild the welfare state. The idea wasn't really worked out in full, but that was the gist of it, and that's what he tried to push. And then he was, well, how to put it? This is a really interesting story. He was removed by his own people. So there's different narratives on this, but Fidesz was probably involved through people that Fidesz controls in the Socialist Party in his removal. So that's where we're at. There are no autonomous organizations in the political opposition anymore. Fidesz has either an external leverage or internal leverages in all parties. And parties differ along that continuum. The Socialists are the least intact. The Socialist Party is a group of warring warlords. And some of them are controlled by Fidesz. I mean, warlords, this is a metaphor here. Strong people, but who don't have a politics, who are there to survive politically. It resembles the 1930s, what happened to the Socialist Party, in Hungary, the Social Democratic Party in the 30s, was similarly dismantled from the outside by an equally dominant, hegemonic right-wing governing party. Very similar. Very
There's
similar.
no Hungarians who miss.
Sorry?
There's no Hungarians who miss other thoughts.
Mélenchon.
No, there isn't.
Mélenchon.
No, there isn't. This is the guy who tried and he failed, and he said when he stepped down, I was a victim of my own people, and remember this, citizens, remember this. That's what he said. Those were the almost exact words. Other parties are more intact, but haven't managed to galvanize support, to embed themselves in society outside the town. So my former party, LMP, is very much like that. It's a Green Party. It has very little. So it won 7% of the vote, just as it did when we got into parliament in 2010. So there's no advancing there. And I could go on and on and on. So that's a very, very difficult situation for a political opposition to be in, especially when you're starved of resources, money. Almost all of the parties are in bankruptcy or close to bankruptcy. Fidesz, by controlling the state audit office, can very heavily fine parties. Jobbik had to pay 2 million euros in fines for illicit campaigning, for receiving illicit donations from an ex-Fidesz oligarch. Complicated story, but yes, Jobbik was supported after its move towards the center by an ex-Fidesz oligarch who put a lot of money into the party, and the state reacted very harshly. So it's very hard to have an autonomous political opposition at this point, and I don't see how it will happen in these 4 years. I think it's going to have to happen outside Parliament. Whatever is coming is going to be coming outside Parliament. It's going to be coming from a movement, but yeah, civil society is also next in line to be curbed and attacked. Orbán has announced a law that there's already a foreign agent law since a year in Hungary. And now there's a next move to basically impose a punitive 25% tax on the organizations that are watchdogs and political, not party political, but political. It's a deliberate attempt to erode that and to prevent an alternative from emerging from civil society. Maybe a couple of years down the line, something will emerge because there'll be so much frustration in society, but for now it's not there. And civil society is much weaker than in this country. Much, much, much weaker. I can't go into why that is, but it's, just don't think of it that way. And the comment on the church, all of the churches are aligned with Fidesz very closely, very, very closely. Orbán's has a very good personal friend who is his priest. He was minister. He was overseeing the biggest ministry responsible for all human resources. This is a guy whose job was to keep Roma down. His job was to withdraw funding from healthcare and public education and to prevent dissent from emerging within the ranks of teachers. Orbán knows exactly before everyone else where dissent could emerge, and he puts his foot there. So it's extremely hard to find levers right now at this point in time. Maybe a couple years down the line we'll see better, and there'll be disgruntlement because Hungary is falling behind the other countries, as I said. So economically, I don't know if this regime is going to be successful in the longer run.
So I want to thank Kristóf and Andrew and Mary. And if it certainly was an education in what we need to worry about and the model of where we don't want to go and where we might be heading. So I think it was a really illuminating. That's why everybody stayed, and that's why there was so many engagement, so much engagement with this story. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming.